250 and municipal planning in order to keep pace with S237 coming out of economic development, and will come to the floor. Actually, it won't be on the floor till next week because it has to go to close. We need to get a running start on that as well. So if anyone has, thanks again for coming in.
Thank you.
If anyone wants to schedule time with the committee on the compost issue, please let our committee assistant Judith Newman know, and we will add you to the schedule the next time we're back on it, because we are going to do a little more work before we're squared away. Thank you.
Senator Bray,
Yes,
just
sir.
so you know, I not only got here late, but I mean, we were waiting for an interview across the street. So.
Okay. Are you available at 5 today? I can
saw-
see that smile. I see
I
you
did
want to
see
be
that.
there.
No, I don't want to be, but yes, I am.
Okay.
I think I can do it.
Thank you. We're going to be getting a bill that will be hot off the press from next door.
And which one? That's the energy one?
The RES.
It's going to cost ratepayers millions and millions and millions of dollars.
That's right.
I'll bet that, yeah.
Some people characterize it as that, others don't. Okay, so we're going to move on. Thank you.
Net metering's more expensive than Rygate.
So, Mr. Czajkowski, if you could join us at the table.
Not for sure.
See.
All right. Dear committee, so S237 is what we're going to switch over to. The House has been working through a housing bill pretty much all session, and it includes provisions related to municipal planning and 250. And the way I think about it is that things that were addressed in 250 that can be addressed through municipal planning, but it's not that things are unplanned, it's a question of where the planning occurs, with whose auspices, in which ways. That was interesting.
Somebody stole my chair and my back is bothering me, so that is
Glad we're all sorted out.
Bipartisan effort.
All right, so everyone should have on their place an S237 bill. If you, Mr. Czajkowski, can give us a walkthrough of, if you want to talk about higher level, like what's going on in here, that's fine too. But I'm looking, I'm just trying to have, we have an hour only, so we're doing a first look. If you can give us a sense of what the bill does, how it does it, and then we'll talk to Mr. Cochran about why someone would want to do this. We're not going to count on you to explain and lobby for the changes.
Thank
Oh.
goodness.
Yeah.
Czajkowski, Office of Legislative Counsel. So you have the as introduced version?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So there is an amendment that the committee is considering, and I sent Senator Bray, I sent you an annotated version.
Yes.
That was just the sections related to zoning, Act 250, and natural resources issues, and so.
I have this one, and that was draft 2.1. When I talked to Senator Sorokin on the floor this morning,
Okay.
I said I saw that there was a 3.1 on the website, and he said, oh, I think we're up to 6.1 now.
Yes.
But I don't know if that all those changes from 2 to 6 have anything to do with what we're going to be working on.
They do.
Oh, they do. Okay, so
This
we'll-
bill is housing related, but a lot of it is related to zoning and Act 250.
Okay.
So,
Can you forward that to me?
I'm sending it to you right
Thank you.
now.
Okay.
So,
And maybe as we walk through this one, you can just sort of call out where there are things still in play, give us a running start on paying attention to where things are still in flux, which is okay in part for the course on crossover week, but we just need good guidance on what's happening where.
sure, I will do my best.
Okay.
So, S237 broadly is promoting affordable housing and attempting to increase density. And so it does that a few different ways, primarily looking at municipal zoning. So starting on page 1, we do a number of things, but the first section involves changes to the municipal plan. So the first change, which is new language on page 2, requires that municipal plans now show the water supply lines, facilities, and service areas, and the sewage disposal lines, facilities, and service areas. So this is just requiring a slightly more detail on the municipal map.
Can I ask a quick question, back on page 1, really, it's lines 12 through 14. It says, a plan for municipality may be consistent with the goals established in section 4302. So 4302 is what, please?
That is the section that has all of the municipal planning goals. It is a pretty long list, but one of the broad themes is compact centers surrounded by rural countryside and open space. And so there's a long list of other things, but it's the broad planning goals for the whole chapter.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And I see, Jude, is this 6-1 that's up on the screen?
Oh, this is what I put up on the screen is the as introduced, because that's what you have in front of you.
Yeah, but I'm having copies made and I was gonna put the new one up.
Okay.
Because you
Yeah,
sent
so
it to me. But I have
just-
2.1 that you sent me, is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll keep going with the
Let's-
one we have in
yeah.
hand for the moment.
And I will flag when we get to one of the changes
Thank you.
from as introduced to the amendment. So we're still in requirements for the municipal plan. Subdivision 10 on page 2 strikes the specific reference that the plan has to include a plan for permanent accessory dwelling units, but the change is now to the broad reference to 4412 in general, which is the section we're going to talk about next. So it broadens it slightly to require that they comply in the plan with all of the provisions of 4412 to provide affordable housing. Let's see.
Thank you. I'm fine, sorry.
Coronavirus, I did hear it.
I do
Building
apologize that I didn't do that, so.
So the next section is we're in Title 24 still, 4412, required provisions and prohibited effects. So we're talking about municipal bylaws. So first, on the top of page 3, this is requiring that, so we're looking at density with this one. So within any regulatory district that allows multi-unit residential dwelling, no bylaw shall have the effect of prohibiting multi-unit residential dwellings of 4 or fewer units as an allowed permitted use, or of conditioning approval based on the character of the area. So if you're establishing a district that allows multi-units, you cannot prohibit less than 4. You can prohibit more than 4, like if you want to say 5 or more, you can't have 5 or more units, but this is allowing up to 4 units in a multi-unit zone.
Okay, and this term right here, within any regulatory district, is regulatory district sort of the phrase that refers to all the types of designated areas?
No, we're talking about zoning districts primarily here. So like, you can have a single family zone, or a multi-unit residential zone, or commercial zone. There's a lot of different types of dwelling of zones.
There's a lot of times, like, I know, like, someone say they'll let you add that second unit, but they won't let you build more than that.
So that's what we're gonna talk about next, which is accessory dwelling units. Yeah. So if there is a zone that's specific, this is just talking about specifically multi-unit zones. Yeah.
Chairman, just for clarification, are we gonna address this week, or, because I'm hearing a rumor we might yank some of this stuff and deal with it, or you're just kind of getting through it?
We're trying to sort out what the best path forward is. Thank you. Yep. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
Thank you, if we can keep going.
Yep, so the next section is regarding the definition of accessory dwelling unit. So this section changes the definition of accessory dwelling unit, and this is where one of the first changes occurs between the as introduced and the amendment proposal. So, it's so interesting having technology in here. So, currently in the statute, an accessory dwelling unit is, bylaws cannot have the effect of prohibiting one accessory dwelling unit that is located within or pertinent to an owner-occupied family dwelling. So this is up on the screen now, and we're adding new language to say that a bylaw may require a single-family dwelling unit with an accessory dwelling unit to be subject to the same review, dimensional or other controls as required for a single-family dwelling without an accessory dwelling unit. An accessory dwelling unit means a distinct unit that has facilities and provisions for independent living, including sleeping, food preparation, and sanitation, provided that the property has sufficient wastewater capacity. So that's the change they're proposing. It's broadening the definition of accessory dwelling unit. So currently under the statute, an accessory dwelling unit means an efficiency or one-bedroom apartment that is clearly subordinate to a single-family dwelling and has facilities for provisions for independent living, including sleeping, food preparation, and sanitation, and the property has sufficient wastewater capacity, and the unit does not exceed 30% of the total habitable floor space. So we are talking about when you have a single-family home, you have the ability to add one unit currently, and it has to be clearly subordinate to the rest of the unit. So we're broadening that. It doesn't have to be one bedroom, and it doesn't have to be 30%. The new draft of the amendment out of Senate Economic Development includes the 30% language. So it now reads, the unit does not exceed 30% of the total habitable floor space, or 900 square feet, whichever is greater. So that is an attempt to still have a size limit on what this unit would be.
Okay.
So for the
Senator McDonald.
900 square feet is larger than. Okay, it's just, I guess that,
I'm sorry.
if the 900 square feet is larger than the remaining size, just you flip it.
Yes, so there was a very long, extensive conversation about whether or not there should be any size restriction on an accessory dwelling unit. And whether or not if a homeowner wants to put a large addition on their home and have that be rented out, should there be a limit to that? And so the counterpoint to that is that currently under statute, towns are allowed to zone for single-family residence only, and by removing the size cap, you essentially allow that everywhere can be a duplex. It removes the restriction on single-family zoning. So this is an attempt to allow some flexibility by having a single-family dwelling add a smaller unit, and they took testimony that Burlington has a similar procedure in theirs, and so that is it's a policy decision whether or not you want there to be a size limitation on the unit.
So it's 30% or 900 feet,
Whichever
whichever is
is greater.
greater.
Where is the 900 feet? I don't
It's
see.
in the amendment that
Okay.
Jude is
Okay, thank you.
trying to get it
Sure,
up.
I saw the 30% crossed out here, and I couldn't find the 900,
Yes.
that's fine.
Yep.
I do have one question.
Right, So, Raj.
So this is only if it's in the same building, this wouldn't cover, I'm gonna build a tiny house beside the main house?
Actually, it does include, located within or appurtenant to an owner-occupied single-family dwelling.
So it actually could be
Yes.
a small.
Yep, like above the
Mother-in-law
garage
house
or
or
carriage
something.
house, yep.
Okay. And it is
Under the same roof?
No,
But attached.
appurtenant to, so within,
Okay, within a.
yeah.
I mean, they date
Right.
as
So you're
opposed to
not
married?
getting into-
and if you said owner occupied, so
Yep.
the owner
Besieged.
can't vacate the original premises and rent them both?
Correct.
Okay.
How does that work with the next home?
You mean if they?
If they sell it to somebody,
Oh, just the new one?
does it have to remain the same?
You sell your
Oh, that's
equipment.
a good question.
You don't have to answer now.
Okay.
You can get back to me.
But may I ask just clarification? So maybe of you, so you have the house, you're building the structure next to it, and you're wondering if, like, is it possible all of a sudden I say, hey, do you wanna buy?
No, I sell the whole place, and
Yeah.
some guy that does nothing but rentals comes in and wants to rent them out, both. This law
Okay.
says the owner has to live there.
I see.
Does it hold everybody going forward to that standard?
Got it, thank you.
So we're in the bylaw section of Title 24, so we're talking about whether or not a town can prohibit anything. So this is setting sort of the floor, or the ceiling. They can be more permissive. A town can be more
Okay.
permissive if they want to allow more flexibility. But I think potentially what you're describing, a town could potentially ban if an owner was attempting to rent the larger unit that they're not occupying. But I'm not 100% on that.
That's fine.
Yeah, but I've seen that where like, an elderly couple moves into a smaller unit and their kids take over the larger dwelling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, so it does happen, but it
Or flips. Yep.
depends, yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
You guys do.
You mean that, when you say the ceiling, you mean upper threshold?
Yes.
Because if it's less than 4 foot of wall, then it's not a ceiling.
Yes. So on the next page, there was an addition of language that says that nothing in subdivision E, so the accessory dwelling unit section, shall be construed to prohibit a bylaw that is less restrictive of accessory dwelling units, or a bylaw that regulates short-term rental units distinctly from residential rental units. So that is some new language. Next, existing small lots. So at the top of page 5, a municipality may prohibit development on a lot not served and not able to connect to municipal sewer and water service if it is less than 1/8 of an acre in area or has a width or depth dimension less than 40 feet. So existing small lots, if they can connect to municipal water and sewer, they should allow development on them. So next is this large section. In the new amendment, we're changing it to inclusive development, which is hopefully a little more descriptive. And this was a proposal originally from the agency requiring that municipalities, that bylaws couldn't prohibit the following things, which were intended to encourage density. So there's a number of provisions in here, and there is been a proposed change to not have this be mandatory, but have it to be voluntary. And so where Senate economic development is currently, they've sort of created a hybrid, which is this section doesn't go into effect for 3 years, so allowing towns to adopt bylaws voluntarily up until that point, at which point it will be mandatory, these guidelines, these provisions.
Okay, so if a town does not have bylaws, then statute controls at that point? Is that the way it works? Like, if you don't write bylaws, this is what will be in charge of the development of your town?
It depends. So,
Right, so I'll just
This
flag
is-
that as a question that we can keep go. I'm just trying to understand the basic construct for how statute and bylaws interact if they're not the same.
Mr. Chair, by bylaws, you're talking about like a local zoning?
Right.
Yeah, so if there's no zoning, what happens?
when?
When you
Year,
want-
year,
So-
year 4. So the 3-year waiting period's done. does this describe what will be the law for each town that has not addressed this issue? Through their own.
So this also allows for a, yes, if they don't establish bylaws that comply with this specifically, these provisions will sort of default. So the way that it's framed is that no bylaw shall have the effect of prohibiting the following things. And so the creation of residential lots that are 1/4 acre, if they're able to connect to water, or 1/8 acre if they're able to connect to water and sewer. So this is saying that the town can't prohibit the creation of small lots if they're able to connect to water and sewer.
Thank you. Since we're in sort of informal mode, trying to make progress, Ms. Horde, you had your hand up. You want to chip in something here?
Thank you. Yes, if a town adopts bylaws, it needs to adopt bylaws in conformance with this statute. If a town doesn't adopt bylaws, anything goes. There's no land use regulation in that community.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
Onward, thank you.
Right, so in addition to this section, alright, so the next provision, C, so we're still in this, no bylaw will have the effect, shall have the effect of prohibiting or requiring conditional use approval for, 2-unit dwellings, so a duplex. If they're, served by and able to connect to water and sewer, so again, attempting to, protect multi-units. Next has to do with parking minimums, so this is a sort of parking minimums are a complicated provision, but when you, if a town has parking minimums and the space is going to be leased separately from the unit, it will count as 2 as instead of 1, so that you can hopefully not have to have as many parking spaces.
As long as you're within a half mile of a transit stop.
Yes.
Okay, so.
And then, so it sets up a provision for an opt-out. So a town can file a substantial municipal constraint report with the Department of Housing and Community Development if they believe that their town has too many constraints and will not be able to effectively implement the sort of density. So if this required increase in density would be too much, a town can file the report, and so they will opt out of having to comply with these. So they have to file the report, and then the department will provide a template and guidance on what should be in the report. The department shall post the reports on the website and provide a copy to the Regional Planning Commission, as well as the state directors for municipal and water sewer funding, the Vermont Community Development Board, the Vermont Downtown Development Board, the HCB, and the Natural Resources Board. Any person may provide comment on the report within 60 days of the filing, and the comments will be posted on the website. And a municipality has to file an update on the report every time they update its plan or bylaws. Failure to do so will disqualify them from the incentives. So
The basic idea being that if, rather than have a town just resistant to the idea of writing such bylaws, that you have to demonstrate why you think you can't comply because of infrastructure limitations in your town, for instance.
right, so it was drafted to be a mandatory provision, but allow the ability to opt out because all towns are different and there may be some constraints on them for increasing density.
Sure. Bristol Village, I know, for instance, has a town septic for the village center, and a restaurant wanted to come in, and I think they actually couldn't have the restaurant because the water flow requirements for a restaurant were high enough to put them over the limit, so. Get it. Thanks.
That's another problem in the state, we've been through with a local restaurant, that the state's requirements for water flow are ridiculously high compared to what people actually use and have been measured for restaurants.
No, it's interesting.
Totally different subject, but relative to that case.
Yeah.
So there are some incentives and funding associated with towns that comply. So towns that do comply with these provisions have access to the following assistance. So they'll receive priority technical assistance through additional funding made available to the Regional Planning Commission and municipal funding through that program as well. Also, the following state funding programs shall prioritize funding for municipalities that have updated their bylaws to comply with this section. So, state funding for municipal water and sewer systems, municipal planning grants, Vermont Community Development Program, and Neighborhood Development Area Historic Tax Credits. And then finally, another incentive is a municipality that has adopted bylaws that comply with the subdivision may adopt bylaws that allow land development that has been restricted by covenants, conditions, or restrictions in conflict with the goals of this section and duly adopted municipal policies. This subsection shall not affect enforceability of existing restrictions. So this is to get at deed restrictions that may attempt to subvert these density requirements. So restrictive deeds or covenants that are in conflict shall not be enforceable.
If added after July 1, 2020.
Correct, that's the next section, right? So it's moving forward. You have to be careful of affecting existing contracts, but moving forward, yes.
So that means you can't go back on deed restrictions from the past, just going forward?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. I was wondering how they were gonna pull that off.
Right. Right. Yeah, so the next section, we're in Title 27, so we're in the sort of property law section, and this talks about it a little bit more. Deed restrictions, covenants, or similar binding agreements running with the land added after July 1, 2020 that prohibit or have the effect of prohibiting land development allowed under the municipal bylaws in a municipality that has adopted a bylaw in conformance with 4412B4, which is the above section, shall not be valid. That's the old language. We've added some other language to add to this section to read, this section shall not affect the enforceability of any property interest held in whole or in part by a qualified organization or state agency as defined in 10 VSA 6301A, including any restrictive easements such as conservation easements and historic preservation rights and interests defined by 10 VSA 822. This section shall not affect the enforceability of any property interest restricted by a housing subsidy covenant defined by 27 VSA section 610 and held in whole or in part by an eligible applicant as defined in 10 VSA 303-4 or the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. So that language was requested by VHCB, so that was added. It's in the new amendment.
So there's an exception for those, I don't know how you categorize them, agencies or whatever.
Conservation easements largely is what they're talking about, and housing.
But an
Yeah.
individual could not write the same kind of conservation easement into their deed and have it carry weight? Is that what we're saying? They're being treated differently than individuals in this case on deed restrictions?
It's less specifically about who and more about what types of deed restrictions are exempt from this.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not necessarily specific to a person, but yeah, restrictive easements such as conservation easements and historic preservation rights.
So an individual could, in theory, still conserve unity restriction.
That was the intent of the language, I think, from VHCB, yeah. Section 4, talks about the municipal constraint reports again. So on or before January 15, 2023, the department shall report back to the General Assembly on the substantial municipal constraint reports they received. So the number of municipalities that have reported substantial constraints, the nature of the constraints, the impact on development of housing in those municipalities, and recommended steps for eliminating those constraints. So that is the end of the sort of municipal Title 24 stuff. Now we're going to transition into Act 250. So
Let me ask a question, genuine question. I don't want us to just rush. I'm also cognizant that we have 25 minutes. So is it your sense that we can make it all the way through the bill this morning? Or about how we think about scheduling it here?
So the next section talks about the broad concept of exemption from Act 250 for downtowns and neighborhood development areas, transferring the administration of the permits over to the municipality. And then in the amendment, there's some further language that was added to address concerns about how this exemption could impact priority housing projects. And so there's some language amending that. There's also wastewater permits, and so those are the broad categories of what's left. So I think we're about halfway through.
Okay.
But
let's keep going, and let's keep going, and we'll ask questions and slow it down when we need to. Otherwise, but it's good to know the big picture. The other, you mentioned wastewater connection permits. Did the committee go through Mike O'Grady's memo this morning?
no.
Okay, so I'll just leave that on hold for now.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
So broadly, the Act 250 changes here establish an exemption from Act 250 jurisdiction for designated downtowns and neighborhood development areas. So it starts with sort of the small details first before we get into like the language of exemption. So
Can I ask a big picture question?
Yes.
If I made two lists of criteria that would be used in any kind of planning work to be done in one of these designated areas versus the Act 250 criteria, I mean, I think we don't need to do this now. Maybe this is something to do offline and get back to the committee with. But I'm just wondering what questions and criteria would we have reviewed under the existing law, and what would we review under the proposed law, and are we giving up on asking some questions that we currently ask of ourselves when we do this plan work?
What if this is removed?
Right, if
Yeah.
you move over
Yeah.
to this proposal,
Yeah.
are
What are we
there,
losing?
are there questions we would have asked as an Act
Good
250
question.
question that we're no longer going to ask?
That's a great question.
And that's, I think,
Be very
really the
helpful.
most fundamental
Yeah.
question I have about the proposal, but let's keep going.
and the very short answer is that we're talking about two different areas. So we have downtown development areas and neighborhood development areas, and they overlap, but there are distinctions between the two areas, what is required for each designation.
Okay.
So you can potentially ask someone to talk more about what is required, and there is some of the sections for those requirements in here, so we can look at some of it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So, yeah. So,
Mr. Cochran, do you wanna jump in while we're
Yeah, well,
going
just
by
on the
this?
subject, sorry to interrupt. It's not in perfect alignment, but the conversation we've had with our environmental partners is these are areas that most people in Vermont agree are appropriate for development. They have water and wastewater infrastructure in place. They can support the kind of development that we want to see, that our laws say we should have. And how do we use our existing designation programs and incentives to support the kind of development we want in these areas. Some feel that the active process in an urban context is not, the criteria are not well suited to evaluate projects in these areas. It's better for greenfield development. So some, to your questions, it is not in a perfect alignment.
Yep.
Not everything's gonna be checked. But the comfort is that these areas are regulated locally, fairly well regulated locally, and our process or designation process reviews that. So, given the overall, what we're trying to do is concentrate development in these centers and protect the countryside. It was seen as a good balance.
Sure, like a smart growth
Yes.
strategy. I did notice, I did a word search on the term shall, the word shall, and there's 74 of them in here. So it seems like it's quite prescriptive as opposed to, here's an opportunity, but can you just frame that up a little? I mean,
Probably all the shalls are in chapter 117. And this was a conversation we had over the summer with many partners
Yep.
about how do we create more housing opportunities in and around our centers. But the shalls are somewhat mitigated by the fact that there's a soft level of compliance here. Communities can opt out if they have constraints. There is several years the communities have to meet these expectations.
okay. There are grants, there's technical assistance.
So there's funding to support this transition.
Thank you.
alright, so I have put up on the screen the amendment language, so that I think that'll be a little bit less confusing. So first,
I love the screen. Thank you for, so helpful.
it's like a whole new world,
It is.
right?
It's just- it's
All the senators are going to do it now.
We hope.
Helpful.
So section 5, we're in 10 VSA 6001. This is the definition section of Act 250. You may become more familiar with it very soon. But this first amendment is changing the definition of mixed income housing. So this is a technical correction that came from VHFA. So there has been for a few years a slight issue with the definition of mixed income housing in Act 250 because VHFA changed their the way that they calculate some of these thresholds. So this language came from them to adjust the definition. So mixed income housing means a housing project in which the following apply: owner occupied housing at the time of initial sale. At least 20% of the housing units meet the requirements of affordable owner-occupied housing under subdivision 15A of this section, adjusted for the number of bedrooms established and published annually by the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. Rental housing for not less than 15 years following the date that rental housing is initially placed in service. At least 20% of the housing units meet the requirements of affordable rental housing under subdivision 29B of this section, adjusted for number of bedrooms as established and published annually by the Vermont Housing Finance Agency. Priority housing project. So a priority housing project under Act 250, if it meets the definition, is exempt up to a certain size. So to encourage these priority housing projects, there are exemptions. So priority housing projects means a discrete project located on a single tract or multiple contiguous tracts of land that consists exclusively of mixed income housing or mixed use or any combination thereof, and located entirely within. And so we're striking the reference to designated downtown and neighborhood development area because those areas are going to be exempt from Act 250 under the next section. So
That's a quick question.
Senator Kansas.
So that's exempt from Act 250, and then, so the local zoning takes over, basically.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So, right. So that definition has to change because of the exemption. So next, we're in section 6081, which is the exemption section of Act 250. So this is a little bit backwards. So stick with me here. Subsection O. If a designation under Chapter 76A, which is where the designated downtown, neighborhood development area, and the others are located, is removed, subsection A of this section, which is the section that requires an Act 250 permit, shall apply to any subsequent substantial change to a development or subdivision that was originally exempt. So this is saying that if the designation of a downtown or neighborhood area is removed, and there's a substantial change, you will need to get an Act 250 permit. And so then P sets out no permit or permit amendment is required for any subdivision, development, or change to a project that is located entirely within a downtown development district designated in 24 VSA 2793, or a neighborhood development area designated under Title 24. Upon receiving notice and a copy of the permit issued by an appropriate municipal panel under 4460F, a previously issued permit for development or subdivision located in a downtown development area or a new neighborhood, that's a typo, is extinguished. So not only are they going to be exempt from Act 250, existing Act 250 permits on property in those areas can be extinguished. Right, so then subdivision V is a reference to the expedited process for downtown development districts that occurs currently, so that is repealed because it's no longer needed. Also, in section 7, section 6083A-D, which refers to the discount on fees that neighborhood development areas get, and then 6086B, which is the expedited process for downtown development areas. Those are both repealed also because they're no longer needed because those areas are exempt.
And so just to make sure I'm following this away correctly, if you're in a neighborhood development area, you basically need to follow that plan. If you don't follow that plan, you sort of lapse back into Act 250 jurisdiction?
If the designation is removed,
right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So then, section 8, we're back in Title 24, and we're in 4460, which is the appropriate municipal panels. And so this sets up the process by which the municipal panel is sort of taking over for the Act 250 permit. So an appropriate municipal panel is either, it depends on the town, so it's either the Development Review Board, the Planning Commission, or the Board of Adjustment, so whoever has control based on what it is in the town. And so this subsection shall apply to a subdivision or development that was previously permitted under Act 250, is located in a downtown development district or neighborhood development area designated pursuant to Chapter 76A, and has applied for a permit or permit amendment required by zoning regulations or bylaws adopted pursuant to this subchapter. So if you're in one of the designated areas, you already have an Act 250 permit and you're applying for a permit or a permit amendment for municipal zoning, you can follow this procedure. So the appropriate municipal panel reviewing a municipal permit or permit amendment pursuant to this subsection shall include conditions contained within an Act 250 permit unless the panel determines that the permit condition pertains to any of the following: the construction phase of the project that has already been constructed, compliance with another state permit that has independent jurisdiction, federal or state law that is no longer in effect or applicable, an issue that is addressed by municipal regulation and the project will meet the municipal standards, or a physical use condition that is no longer in effect or applicable, or will no longer be in effect or applicable once the new project is approved. After issuing or amending a permit containing permit conditions pursuant to this subsection, the appropriate municipal panel shall provide notice and a copy of the permit to the Natural Resources Board. The appropriate municipal panel shall comply with the notice and hearing requirements provided in subdivision 4464. In addition, notice shall be provided to those persons that are required under Act 250, and that it shall explicitly reference the existing Act 250 permit. So, this language is in the big House Act 250 bill. Senate Economic Development didn't change it, although in the most recent draft in 6.1, I did amend subdivision 4 to just make it a little more clear. But this is setting up that a municipal panel can extinguish the Act 250 permit once they have transferred the conditions from that permit into the municipal permit, unless they find that the conditions are no longer applicable.
So at some point, we need to reconcile this with each 926.
Yes.
Correct, okay. The House Active, got it, thank you.
And, oh, yes.
We being both bodies.
I'm not quite sure exactly how this Vulcan mind meld
we just
happened,
committee-
but
being
we'll
me,
get
maybe,
there.
I don't know.
Pardon?
Yeah,
Me, maybe, I don't know.
I think,
The appropriate municipal panel's decision shall be recorded, and shall be issued in accord with this, subsection, and shall include specific findings with respect to, determinations pursuant to the above subsection about whether or not they're transferring the conditions. Any final action by the appropriate municipal panel affecting a condition, shall be recorded in the municipal land records.
the new board member here, is this, is the current board 11 people and it's going to 12? This is all we're seeing?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and this is for the downtown, this is for the state designation board. Yep. And this, yeah, so adding, the executive director of the HCCB. So now, section 10, we're in the requirements for what is required for a downtown development district. So we added language here, so we struck the reference to Act 250 because they're going to be exempt from Act 250, but there's additional language that came from the Affordable Housing Coalition, because there is concern that by exempting downtowns and neighborhood development areas from Act 250, there will be less of an incentive for priority housing. So this is to, so designated downtown must include a housing element in its plan in accordance with subdivision 4382 that achieves the purposes of 4302, this title, and includes clear implementation steps for achieving mixed income housing, including affordable housing, a timeline for implementation, responsibility for each implementation step, and potential funding sources. Adopted one of the following to promote availability of affordable housing opportunities in the municipality. Inclusionary zoning as provided in 4414. A restricted housing trust fund with designated revenue streams. A housing commission as provided in section 4433 of this title, or impact fee exemptions or reductions for affordable housing as provided in 5205 of this title. So they have to have one of these things that will hopefully promote affordable housing in the downtown. Then in the middle of this page, so starting on line 12, that section I just read you will not go into effect until July 1, 2022, and that's to give the handful of towns that are up for review time to comply with that section so they don't go out of compliance.
Okay.
Next, Section 11 condenses the sort of incentive program for village centers. It previously listed out all the tax credits, and now they're sort of just more succinctly listed as the downtown and village center tax credit program. Section 12, so now we're in the requirements for a neighborhood planning and development area. So this language relates to flood hazard areas. So currently the language reads, so this is what is required in an application for a neighborhood development area. The proposed neighborhood development area consists of those portions of the neighborhood planning area that are appropriate for new and infill housing. And currently it excludes identified flood hazard and fluvial erosion areas, but that language has been struck. And so it now reads, including only areas containing pre-existing development and areas suitable for infill development as defined in the Vermont flood hazard area and river corridor rules. So this is changing slightly whether or not an area can be in a neighborhood development area if it's in a flood hazard area.
Say that again, please.
What would be the significance of old language versus new? Please.
So, currently it excludes areas identified in the flood hazard area, and this is allowing only areas containing pre-existing development. So it's sort of it's expanding slightly what areas can be in the neighborhood development area to include area in the flood hazard area that include pre-existing development and areas that are suitable for development in development.
I just need some clarification on it. It just sounds like it could be a problem.
Well,
So
Mr.
last-
Cochran's putting his hand up,
last-
maybe he has a thought.
The last word in that sentence is rule. So the question is, what do the rules prohibit?
So the neighborhood development area program was basically last touched right after Tropical Storm Irene, and it made an outright prohibition of including any river corridor areas within the designated center. Subsequent to that, A&R adopted their river corridor rules that allows appropriate infill within centers. Many of the corridors within our centers are managed channels, they're riprap, they're controlled, they're not going to flood. So it allows appropriate development, in development that's not going to make anything worse. You have to elevate the building, but it allows appropriate development to support our overall smart growth goals, for our infrastructure needs, our communities are. So what this change does is it brings the neighborhood development area designation program in alignment with A&R river corridor procedures and rules.
Okay.
Which prompts the question, what does "are not going to flood" mean?
Right.
So we'll flag it and keep going, but I think it's
That's a
I
good.
mean, I think there's probably a shared goal here. Develop smartly, don't develop in places where things are gonna get wiped out by flooding. And how do we describe where those areas are?
And look upstream and downstream for opportunities to protect floodplains, to ensure your centers are protected. So it is a little bit more broad than that. We work closely with A&R on this language as
Yep.
well with the NRC.
Sure.
And
I
I think
know.
you got a memo from Kate.
Okay, right. Middlebury, for instance, by virtue of having floodplains south of it, was saved an estimated $3 million worth of damage during Tropical Storm Irene. So,
A memo from whom? Kate.
McCarthy.
Oh, did we all get that?
I'll make
Okay.
sure.
Yeah, no, I just
everyone-
want to make sure I didn't miss it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll put it on the website. Did you get CC'd on that?
I don't think so.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Right, so still in this section, so based on these considerations, the municipality shall select an area for the neighborhood development area designation that avoids or minimizes to the extent feasible the inclusion of important natural resources and flood hazard area and river corridors, so we add that language there. And then further onto the next page, page 21. If the neighborhood development area includes flood hazard areas or river corridors, the local bylaws must contain provisions consistent with A&R's rules required for flood hazard areas to ensure that the new infill development within a neighborhood development area occurs outside the floodway. A new development is elevated or flood-proofed at least 2 feet above base flood elevation or otherwise reasonably safe from flooding, and will not cause or contribute to fluvial erosion hazards within the river corridor. If the neighborhood development area includes flood hazard areas or river corridors, local bylaws shall contain provisions to protect river corridors outside of the neighborhood development area, consistent with A&R's model river corridor bylaws.
Sir McDonald?
Does the language defines something it is not gonna be flooded as 2 feet above something?
Yeah, 2 feet above base flood elevation.
So why doesn't the statute just simply say that and not add the impossible statement that it will not be flooded? Why 2 feet above such and such means 2 feet above such and such? Tagging it with shall not be flooded is a pipe dream. So, who are we to say what will or won't be flooded?
Sure,
So that's
this-
a question to us, not you.
Okay, great, so I can tell you that this language was added, in direct response to testimony from BNRC. I only made minor amendment to it, so
Sounds like it's taken from the parable.
I mean, one of the challenges is, for instance, we all know that, like in the Mississippi River area, this past decade, they've had something like 500-year floods. So the new realities of what's going on with water, I'm not. We'll need
Those
to,
kind of declarative statements.
right. We'll need to
It's very
be
fluid.
prudent.
It is new.
What's that?
It's new.
It's noon. Okay. Well, we're getting close. How about if we do 2 more minutes, and then we'll pause and come back. We'll schedule more time for this.
Sure. So, on page 22, we're still in the requirements for a neighborhood development area, so this is adding that within a neighborhood development area, the municipal bylaws allow minimum lot sizes of 1/4 of an acre or less. So that's, again, to encourage density, which is throughout this bill. It then strikes the reference to Act 250 because they will be exempt from Act 250. And then we jump to page 24. So this language is similar to the language I read a couple pages before that was added to the designated downtown section. So it's adding a requirement for affordable housing element as part of the designated neighborhood development area. So that's onto the top of page 25. And like with the designated downtown, the effective date is pushed out until July 1, 2022 to give towns time to comply with this so they don't go out of compliance with the designation. Again, we strike the reference to Act 250. Act 250. And, yep, on page 28, again, the reference to Act 250, and so it makes reference to the administrative officer as opposed to the district coordinator. Section 13 updates the tax credit language to include neighborhood development areas.
That'll be a finance thing. So.
Neighborhood development areas, and then it adds language for a qualified flood mitigation project. And Section 14 then changes the cap on tax credits. Oh, whoops, sorry. And then the final section, sorry, I'm having a hard time with your laptop here. So then we have section 15, 16, and 17 have language related to wastewater connection permits. and this is not my area of expertise. Mike O'Grady did recently look at this language and has some issues with it. The intent of it was to have towns, to reduce having both the town and the state issue municipal wastewater permits, but having just the town issue the permit as opposed to the state.
And Mike, we'll have Mr. O'Grady in to go through a memo. He did a markup on these sections, so we'll
Yeah.
check in with him on wastewater. Thank you.
Then there is an appropriation section, and
So not us.
that's it, and then the effective dates. So that was the really quick version of all of these things.
Great, perfectly timed. So thank you everyone for staying a little over. So we will schedule more time on it. Thanks for your help today. We'll adjourn, and I think we have about 10 minutes till we have caucus. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
So while the committee's adjourning, I would just want to make sure, so Mr. Cochran, I'm sorry we didn't get to you today. Is there anyone else in the room who wants to speak about these provisions? And your name is?
Renee Carpenter.
Okay. And can you give your
Yes.
name and contact information, please, to June? Thank you. And just big picture, I mean, I think one of the things Senator McDonald was pointing out to me while we were working our way through is, we talked about it at the outset, there's also an Act 250 bill, and there's some relationship between the Act 250 bill and this bill. And one of our challenges is going to be find a way not just to reconcile them, but they're not separate. They're separated in time. This one's coming through now.
Yes.
We're really not going to we won't have the Act 250 bill in hand to work on for roughly another week because of our own obligations. So we'll have to figure a rational way to reconcile these things in the end. So we're doing one set of coherent changes as opposed to things that are a little out of joint in two different bills.
But that leads to, one of the ways to do that is not to pass this bill out of this body and to attach it to the one from the other body, which in the end may include nothing that the other body has proposed. So this is a complicated thing.
Right. Yes, and I think probably Senator Roth has some thoughts on that too.
No, I mean, you can literally put this bill on that other bill and remove everything from the other bill.
Sounds familiar.
And the other body can do the same thing. We'll need to send this over.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. So we are adjourned.
Thank you.
I'll get hold of Kate McCarthy and give it.
Oh, yeah, no, I was just
No, it's
curious that she weighed in on it.
Yes.
I trust her.
I think she did just before going off on maternity.
She did have her baby.
Great.
Healthy boy.
Nice to hear that.
Have you read this?
I'm sorry.
I read it a while ago. I'm rereading it.
No,